Hi, I'm Desiree. Welcome to my Dark Happy Place. Thanks for joining me today. I'm so glad you made it. Welcome to episode number 5. How is everyone? Sorry I missed last week. I'm just now starting to get over being sick. I'm sure you can still hear it in my voice a little bit, but at least this week I have a voice, so there's that. Today's case is going to be about a robbery/home invasion that unfortunately ends in murder. With that being said, cue the trigger warning. Today's episode is intended for mature audiences only. The topic today contains real events that happened to real people. There will be graphic descriptions of very sensitive subjects such as gun violence, robbery, and murder. Listener discretion is advised. Alright, let's get into the case of Donald Lehman. The Lehman family lived in Rogers, Arkansas. Donald was a real estate developer and owned a construction company. He was married to a woman named Virginia, and together they had a daughter named Vicky. Honestly, that's about as much information as I have about this family. I couldn't find as many details as I normally try to include, so we're just going to get into the events that take place. On the night of January 8th, 1981, Donald and his family were getting ready for bed, getting ready to settle down for the night, and around 9:45 p.m. their doorbell rang. He got out of bed. His daughter followed quickly behind him, trying to go to the door and see who was there. Don got to the door. He started to open it just a couple of inches, just a little bit, so that he could see out and see who's there, and that's when the door was pushed in on him by 4 men wearing ski masks. These men were Hoyt Franklin Kleins, Darrell V. Richley, James Williams Holmes, and Michael Ray Orndorff. These 4 men pushed the door in so hard that it knocked Don off of his feet, and the doorknob from the front door actually got stuck in the closet door behind it when it hit. 3 of the men had guns, and 1 of the men was armed with a metal motorcycle chain. Darrell walked into the house and grabbed Vicky, while 2 of the other men grabbed Don. Darrell pushed Vicky to the floor, and she was held at gunpoint, and Don did break away from the other 2 men for just a little bit as he was trying to get to Vicky, but he was quickly grabbed and beaten with the motorcycle chain. Vicky was ordered to kneel facing the wall with her head in her hands. As that was happening, Don was being pushed and chased into his bedroom, and as he was running that way, he started yelling for Virginia to grab the gun. Vicky heard everything that was going on. She heard all the commotion. She could tell that there was a struggle. And then she heard gunshots. After the gunshots, Darrell picked Vicky up off the floor and started taking her from room to room in the house, yelling at her, telling her to give him whatever valuable she could, jewelry, money, anything. She ended up leading him into her room where she had her Christmas money stashed in an envelope. She gave him that envelope that had $70 in it. After getting that from her, Darrell dragged her into her parents' room, and she saw her dad lying on the bed, not moving, bloody, and her mom, Virginia, was huddled over in the corner. Hoyt and James were going through the drawers of the bedroom, looking for money, tossing things around, while Darrell stayed by Vicky, keeping her at gunpoint. According to Vicky, Michael was just kind of there. He was just kind of kicking things around on the floor, not really participating as much as the other guys were. At some point during the search for the money, Hoyt ended up finding several $100s in one of the drawers, and he got so excited that he decided to take his ski mask off. I mean, I don't understand the point of wearing a ski mask if you were just going to take it off when you got excited. Isn't the point of a ski mask to make sure you're not seen? While all of this was going on, at some point Virginia did get up and make her way over and kneel by Don on the bed. Michael suggested that Vicky should be able to go and call for help for her dad, so Darrell took her to the kitchen and was going to let her call for help. Hoyt overheard this conversation and the plan, and he beat them to the kitchen. He got there and he snatched the phone away from Vicky and pulled the cord out of the wall so that she could no longer call for help. As he was pulling the cord out of the wall, him and Vicky made contact, and if you remember, Hoyt is the one that pulled his mask off. The men all came out into the living room, and at this point they started demanding to know where the guns were kept, and Vicky told them they were kept in a safe in the living room. Darrell started giving instructions to the other men. Hoyt was supposed to go with Michael and get in the car, and James was supposed to move the guns. One of the men said, "I'll finish him off this time," and went back into the bedroom, shooting and killing 47-year-old Don Lehman. Luckily for Virginia and Vicky, no one really seemed to care that Hoyt had taken his mask off and that they would be able to identify him. In total, the entire attack lasted about 30 minutes, and the 4 men made off with $1,200 and multiple guns. Don's autopsy revealed there was damage to his bones and there was metal embedded in the cuts on his face from the chain that he was beat with. He'd been shot 2 times in the chest with a .22 caliber gun as he was being chased into the bedroom. Those shots didn't kill him. It seems that the beating from the chain had actually just left him unconscious, because the final shot to his head, after the guy said he would finish him off, was determined to be his cause of death. Vicky and Virginia talked to the police and gave them their statement. Virginia's retelling of the events was a little bit more vague than Vicky's was, because Vicky was able to recount the entire thing, and she even gave descriptions of the men to the police. She didn't have their names yet, but I'm using them so that we know who's who. There was the small one, who was Michael, the big one, who was James, Daryl, he's the one that was with her, and he was the tallest and wore wire-rimmed glasses, and she said she could see them under his mask. Vicky was able to give enough information about Hoyt, the one who took his mask off, that she saw face-to-face when he pulled the cord out of the wall for the phone. She was able to give enough information on him to get a sketch for the police. She did then pick him out of a lineup after she gave the description for that sketch. One of the things both of the women agreed on, no matter how vague or detailed their retelling was they weren't exactly sure who had shot Don. The next day, January 9th, Daryl was arrested in Fayetteville for criminal impersonation. When he was arrested, his car was searched and the stolen guns from Don's were found. It wasn't long before he started talking. Shortly after his arrest, the other 3 men were arrested as well. While the police were collecting evidence at the home, there was a footprint found out front in the flower bed. An impression was taken, and it's believed to be Hoyt's footprint, but that was never able to be conclusively confirmed as his. Since all 4 men basically committed the same crime, I mean, there was a little bit of difference in participation, but basically the same thing, it was decided that they were going to have a joint trial. This meant all 4 were going to be tried at the same time for the same crime. All 4 were charged with capital murder and 2 counts of aggravated robbery. There was some pushback about them all having the same trial, but in the end that motion was denied, and the trial began in September of 1981, 8 months after the murder and robbery took place. There's tons of evidence pointing to the fact that these guys were clearly guilty. According to a few different people, the 4 guys had been out talking about going to rob some rich old man in Rogers earlier that week. There was also information they'd discussed that they'd murder somebody if things went sideways. Earlier the day before the murders, the men had been at the house of Tammy and Steve Baker. They'd been hanging out that day there, drinking beer, playing cards, and trying to convince Steve to come with them that night, but he didn't want to be involved. Tammy said that actually when they had gotten to her house that day, one of them put on a ski mask and put a gun in her face, telling her to stick 'em up as a joke. Yep, so it seems like these were some great guys. Tammy said the 4 guys had left her house at around 9:30 p.m., so about 15 minutes before the doorbell at Don's rang, and she said she'd overheard the conversation about the robbery that they were planning to go and commit. She confirmed that Hoyt was the one that had the motorcycle chain when he was at her house. Tammy was asked by Hoyt's attorney if Steve had been involved in a robbery the night before the murders, so on January 7th, and she said yeah, he was. The lawyer then went on to make a mistake that probably hurt his client's case more than it helped it, because he asked if any of the 4 men were involved in the robbery that Steve was on January 7th, and Tammy said yep, Hoyt and Michael were. I feel like that just gave the jury information that this wasn't a one-time situation, that this guy was a habitual criminal, so I don't understand why the lawyer thought that was a good plan. Steve Baker, Tammy's husband, also confirmed that he had been involved in a robbery the night before and said that the 3, Hoyt, Michael, and himself, had robbed 2 men at gunpoint. Apparently, Michael had been asked to be taken home the night of the murder before the robbery happened as they were leaving the Bakers, and then after the murder, he said that he hadn't wanted to be involved. So he tried to say that meant he wasn't as responsible for the murder. I mean, if he didn't want to be there, couldn't he have just maybe not gone? Maybe not walk in the house? Maybe not get in the car to drive there? I don't know. I mean, it seems like it could have been avoided if you really didn't want to be there. There was a statement given by a man named Billy Weaver who said that Daryl had said he was involved in Don's home invasion and he was the one that actually shot and killed Don. A man named Freddie Baker, who I'm not sure if he's related to Tammy and Steve or not, testified that Daryl had gone to his house within a day or two after the murder, asking for help selling the stolen guns. Freddie said that Daryl told him all about the murder that night. He said that according to Daryl, the four guys broke in, and that when Don took off towards the bedroom, Hoyt took the chain and started whipping Don with it. Daryl said that that is when Hoyt took his mask off, which varies a little bit from Vicky's retelling, but semantics. He said the reason that Don was shot in the head and killed was because he was trying to get a gun that was above the bed. After the trials were over, all four men were convicted of capital murder and both counts of aggravated robbery on October 30th of 1981. All four men received life for the robbery charges, and they all received the death penalty for the capital murder charge. Now, something standard within basically all cases, especially in death penalty cases, there are appeals. So in 1988, an appeal was filed regarding an issue with Vicky's testimony being compromised. After Vicky gave her initial report to the police, but before the trial, her and her mom were taken to a hypnotist, a man named Gene Peters, by the prosecutor David Klinger. This man Gene didn't have a degree or any licensing to be a hypnotist, but he had taken a 6-month course. So I looked up what a hypnotist, I guess, is supposed to have to be considered, credible. And apparently they're supposed to have a bachelor's degree and, some other qualifications and licensing to be considered an accredited hypnotherapist. I mean, this could have changed. This was back in the 80s, but that's what it says today. Either way, hypnosis is not admissible in court. Prosecutor Klinger said that he didn't submit the information to defense about the hypnosis before the trial because nothing new was found. Judge Henry Woods looked over all of the information and decided that there were enough differences in Vicky's statements to police before the hypnosis and after during the trial. These differences were things like the men's shoes, some of their physical appearances, how many guns they had when they entered the home, where they were at different points in the attack, and who actually ordered her to give them the guns. So in 1990, Judge Woods stated that either there had to be a whole new trial for each of the men, or their sentence was going to be reduced to life without parole. So that's what happened. Instead of going through an entire new trial, their death sentences were overturned, and they now all had sentences of life without parole for the capital murder charge. After the reversal and resentencing of the four men, the cases were then reviewed by the 8th District Circuit Court in 1994. During the review, multiple factors were looked at. They were looking at each man individually, they were looking at their prior criminal history, their involvement in the attack, and the court was comparing Vicky's initial statement to her statements at trial to see how much they differed. The court wanted to look at all these factors and see if anything had been presented differently, or if the statements had been swapped out, could that have swayed the jury's decision at all. The court took into consideration Daryl's prior criminal history, looking at the fact that he had planned out and completed several robberies prior to the one at the Lehmans that night. The court saw in both pre- and post-hypnosis that Vicky had described him as the leader and said he threatened to kill her. They looked at her initial statement saying Daryl was definitely in the room when her dad was shot to her trial statement post-hypnosis saying he might have been in the room when her dad was killed. These discrepancies were minimally different to the court. When looking at James, they looked at his placement and his role in the attack that night. Initially, Vicky said James and Hoyt had both come in the door and attacked her dad, but in her trial statement, she said James was the first in the house that night. So Vicky had her initial statement, right? The one that I keep talking about. But she also had a second initial statement before hypnosis that I found out a little bit later after in my research. During the second initial statement to police, Vicky said that Hoyt had been the one that demanded the guns, but then at trial said that James had been the one to demand the guns from her. Neither of those factors seemed like a big deal to the court. In both, James was one of the first in the house, whether he was the first or the second or whatever. His involvement didn't differ much. As for who demanded the guns, in her first initial statement, she said there were 3 men in front of her demanding guns, which would have most likely included Hoyt and James, so this was not looked at as an issue with her statement. The prosecution had also shown that James was part of Daryl's prior robberies, showing him as being a habitual criminal. As for Hoyt, the court saw that Vicky hadn't really changed much about his participation. She repeatedly said he was one of the first ones in the house to attack her dad. She said that he's the one that ripped the phone cord out of the wall, and that he was in the bedroom at the time of her dad's murder. After weighing out all the factors, the court ended up finding the differences were not significant and were harmless. So the 8th District Circuit Court reversed Judge Wood's decision and the men were back on death row. Well, all except for Michael. So in Vicky's initial statement, Michael's participation contradicts his participation in her post-hypnotic testimony at trial in a great enough proportion that the court thought that was an issue. At trial, she said he'd been acting squirrely at her house and that he kept playing with little toys he found laying around, like a toy slot machine that he kept pulling the lever on the side of. Aside from that, she said he was running around the house and at some point he had swung on a chandelier as she was being taken down to call for help. In her initial statement, she made no mention of the squirrely, playful behavior that Michael had. The only time she mentioned anything in her initial statement as to Michael's behavior was saying that as the men were leaving, he grabbed a little trinket and broke it as they were walking out. At trial, she also said that Michael kept looking out the window during the search in the bedroom, saying that the neighbors could see them, but she never mentioned this in her initial statements. Like I said, the court thought these were big enough issues in her statements that the jury might have been able to see him as having less participation and that it was more of a peer pressure situation if the statements had been presented differently. After they decided and agreed with Judge Wood's decision to reverse his death penalty, he either would have to have a new sentencing trial or just stick with the life without parole. And the Lehman family decided, instead of going through an entire new sentencing trial and having to relive everything, just to let him stick with the life without parole sentence. The 3 men that were on death row, Daryl, Hoyt, and James, were all held at the Cummins Unit, which is a max security prison in Gold, Arkansas. With them still being on death row, there was the matter of completing their execution. Their execution had been set 3 different times, specifically by Bill Clinton, at the time he was the governor of Arkansas. The for real actual execution date was officially finally set for August 3rd, 1994. This was a very big matter because, well, for one, a lot of people opposed the death penalty altogether, but for 2, because this was going to be a triple execution, meaning all 3 men would be executed on the same day. The triple execution was a very big deal because this was the first time it was going to be happening in 32 years and the first time it would be happening at all since the U.S. had reinstated the death sentence. Now, if you weren't aware, there was a federal suspension on executions from 1972 until 1976, meaning nobody was executed during those 4 years. Triple executions are extremely rare. It's a little more common to have multiple states schedule executions on the same day, and that's happened 13 times since 1977, but 3 men at the same prison within hours of each other, basically unheard of. For reference, this triple execution that was going to take place in 1994, and only one other in Arkansas in 1997, had been the only triple executions at the prison on the same day. So there were like 2 in all of U.S. prison history. There was a ton of pushback on this. Daryl's lawyer, Mark Cambiano, said the execution shouldn't happen because mass executions were inhumane and said that Arkansas is the only state to carry out mass executions, which was true until 1997 when Illinois executed 2 men on the same day at Statesville, but I guess that's not 3 men, so he's not wrong. Mark Cambiano compared the mass executions to leading hogs to slaughter. Others who opposed the triple execution were Leigh Dingerson of the National Coalition to Abolish the Death Penalty and Diane Rust Tierney, the director of Capital Punishment Project for the American Civil Liberties Union in Washington. Lee said the triple execution showed the nation was desensitized and numb to executions. Diane said, quote, "The notion that Arkansas is getting into this assembly line mentality doesn't fit with our societal respect for life," unquote. Alan Abels, the spokesman for the Cummins Unit, said the triple execution was useful because it cut down on stress to the employees and it saved the state money. He responded to the criticism, saying that, quote, "If anybody's going to be criticizing us, it's nice to be criticized for being efficient," unquote. Like I said, all 3 guys were supposed to be executed one after another within hours of each other, so there had to be practice and preparation for this unusual circumstance to make sure that everything ran smoothly. There were practice runs, and the guards were taken step by step. They walked through walking the men down to the death chamber, strapping the men over and over just to make sure that everything went right. Hoyt, James, and Darrell were set to be executed in order of their prison number, so Hoyt would be first, James would be second, and then there would be Darrell. Mark Cambiano submitted a last-minute appeal for a stay of execution, and Darrell specifically asked U.S. Supreme Court Justice Harry Blackmun to stop his execution. The last-minute appeal argued again about the prosecution failure to disclose the hypnosis that Vicky had gone through, and said that the group execution violated the Supreme Court mandated right to individualized discretionary sentencing procedures. Darrell specifically had asked Justice Blackmun because Blackmun opposed the death penalty, so he hoped that that would help him get this stay. Hoyt and James also had appeals pending and hoped to have their execution stopped. There's always that last-minute appeal, hoping for the stay of execution, hoping that something gets overturned or whatever. The Arkansas State Supreme Court had given Hoyt, Darrell, and James a stay of execution 2 different times before this final execution date, hence it being rescheduled so many times. The U.S. Supreme Court would not listen to their clemency appeals this time. The week of his execution, Darrell had actually told the prison panel, quote, "Kill me and get this comedy over with," unquote. On August 3rd, 1994, Hoyt, James, and Darrell prepared for their execution. All of the men had chosen lethal injection over the electric chair. They all had their final meals. Hoyt had 2 pounds of fried shrimp, fries without the skin, some ketchup, a Dr. Pepper, and banana pudding for dessert. James had an 8-ounce hickory smoked sausage, some Kraft Cracker Barrel cheese in either mild or sharp cheddar, a Wendy's double cheeseburger with pickles, onions, lettuce, and mayonnaise, some fries with ketchup, a kosher dill pickle, an onion, a Coca-Cola, and for dessert, he had a Breyers Vignetta ice cream cake combo. Darrell had a rare porterhouse steak, extra sharp cheese, a salad with blue cheese dressing, and a root beer. He did not have any dessert. 3.5 hours before the executions were set to begin, James was granted a temporary stay of execution while his appeal for ineffective counsel was being heard. Because of this temporary stay, that messed up order of the executions just a little bit. Hoyt was still the first to be executed, and he was pronounced dead at 7:11 p.m. at 37 years old. So, like I said, the execution order was a little bit messed up because James was supposed to be second and Darrell was supposed to be third. But since there was the stay, Darrell's execution got moved up, and he ended up with just less than an hour to prepare for his execution. He was only given a 10-minute warning and wasn't able to read the final letter from his brother or write any final letters to his family. Darrell was pronounced dead at 8:09 p.m. at 43 years old. James' appeal was eventually overturned, and he was then executed after Darrell. James was pronounced dead at 9:24 p.m. at 37-year-old. None of the 3 men had any final statements. Now, I said there were split opinions on the death penalty. I gave you those who were against it. I gave you their statements before the execution happened, and now there's a piece that I'm going to read that I found while I was researching that kind of sums up those other side of things, those who were for their executions. The piece I'm talking about is from Bob Greene, who's a writer for the Chicago Tribune. He wrote an article that was entitled "Killers as Victims, A Criminal Thought" on August 7, 1994, just a few days after the men were executed. He said in the article, quote, "Weep, if you will, for the 3 murderers who were painlessly put to death last Wednesday for their terrible deeds. Some of us will save our tears for the family they destroyed. Certainly no reporter ever inquired what Donald Lehman was served for his last meal, the way reporters asked what Kleins, Holmes, and Ridgely had ordered for their supper last Wednesday. Lehman had no chance to beg for his life, the way the killers were given endless chances to let lawyers beg for theirs." Unquote. Now, as for Michael, he's the one who ended up with life without parole for everything, and he tried to appeal to have his murder conviction overturned back in 2005. He said it wasn't about getting out of prison, because he would still have to be in prison for life for the robbery charge, because he wanted to get some things and be able to participate in some programs that convicted murderers aren't able to do. He said he didn't kill Don, and in fact he'd even tried to get him help. My issue with this appeal is that, yeah, cool, you didn't kill him, but you went there knowing that the plan was to kill someone if things went sideways, so at the very least you would be an accomplice, correct? The court saw things in a similar way as I just explained, and showed that he was out on parole already for burglary and forgery at the time that the murder took place, and used that as more reason to not overturn his conviction. Michael is still in prison, currently being held at the East Arkansas Region Unit in Bricky's, Arkansas. He hasn't had any major disciplinary action, according to his profile on the Arkansas Department of Corrections inmate search page. He only had one for refusing a direct verbal order back in 2018 and has completed several programs, including anger management. So that's it. That's the case of Donald Lehman. You can find the podcast on Instagram, Twitter, or Facebook at Dark Happy Pod. I'll be posting pictures on Instagram if you want to see who I talked about today. You can find all future episodes on Spotify or wherever you're listening now. You can also check out the podcast website at mydarkhappyplace.com, where you'll be able to find everything I've already talked about all in one place. I'll be here next week with another episode, so be ready and mark it down on your calendars. Bye!